Good morning and welcome to this panel focusing on the geopolitical and foreign policy dynamics in Pakistan, South Asia, and beyond. A very simple and small topic, which I assume all three of my panelists will tackle very well. My name is Kapil Sharma, and I serve as the Senior Director for the South Asia Center and a colleague of Uzair at the Pakistan Initiative. I'm excited about this panel because the objective of the panel is to better understand how countries from the Gulf Cooperation Council, or the GCC, the Middle East, such as Iran, and Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, have been managing their economic and foreign policy interests during these very turbulent times, which has been a theme over the last 2 days. Since we want this to be an actionable conference, we really want the panelists and some of the questions to really key out what are the key learnings that we can get from middle powers and their policies that can help guide and possibly provide a crystal ball for Pakistan and its own foreign policy choices. Now, I do want to make this also a very active panel. And so yesterday I heard that one of the panels received 10 questions online and from the audience. I will challenge everybody here that we should be able to get more than 10 questions for 3 very good panelists that I respect very dearly. If you want to ask questions online, please go to askask.org, and they will pop right in front of me, and I will be able to ask them. So we're going to jump right into it, and I want to start with Meredith and go right into Southeast Asia. Recently, Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Jalil Abbas Jalani, spoke on the importance of a peaceful and stable Asia-Pacific and emphasized that Pakistan was ready to collaborate with ASEAN states in achieving goals of confidence building and conflict prevention. He also mentioned that Pakistan's support for international order based on principles such as peaceful coexistence, amicable dispute resolution, win-win cooperation, and shared prosperity. One of Pakistan's key relationships in ASEAN is Indonesia, a partnership that started in 1951. And the caretaker Prime Minister Anwar al-Haq Kakar has said Pakistan's relationship with China is the cornerstone of its foreign policy and an anchor for regional peace and development. With that in mind, can Pakistan's leadership learn from Indonesia on how to balance its relationship between the US and China and the geopolitical rivalry between the two countries?
Thanks, Kapil, and thanks very much to the Atlantic Council and my alma mater, SAIS, for including me in this discussion. Indonesia and Pakistan have a very important relationship and a very historic one. They celebrated their 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations in 2020. And Pakistan, as you mentioned, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Pakistan has been a sectoral dialogue partner of ASEAN since 1993 and a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum since 2004. Indonesia has a lot in common with Pakistan, I think, as well. It's the 4th largest country in the world, a democracy, and the largest Muslim majority country in the world, with Pakistan as the 2nd. And it, like Pakistan, is also looking at how to manage an increasingly fraught international geopolitical environment. I think Indonesian policymakers would absolutely share Pakistan's view that China is a critical stakeholder for regional peace and prosperity. And importantly, for Indonesia, it's an increasingly important economic partner and source of investment inflows. The United States is also a really important partner for Indonesia, a very significant export market, a longtime investor in the country. And Indonesians quietly appreciate the security umbrella and constraint that the US provides vis-a-vis China's quite expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea, which also impinge on the Natuna Islands, which are significant economically for Indonesia in terms of fishery stocks, but also gas resources that they're seeking to develop. Before going directly to the tools that Indonesia is using that Pakistan could consider integrating more fully into its approach, I wanted to share a little bit of context on Indonesia's relationships with both China and the US, which have evolved considerably since the country's independence. In the case of China and the US, Indonesia has oscillated from time to time between the two, although since independence it has identified as a non-aligned country and a country that pursues what they call a free and active foreign policy, meaning maximizing strategic autonomy and playing as active a role as conditions and capabilities provide. So for Indonesia historically, that's very much been focused on Southeast Asia, but we see that increasingly on the global stage as well. In the period following independence, Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, was very close to China. He was left-leaning. He was close to the Indonesian Communist Party and eventually was pushed out because of a failed coup in 1965, which brought President Suharto to power. He ruled from 1968 to 1998. He outlawed the Communist Party. There was a pretty brutal crackdown. Many people died, and severed relations with China until 1990. He also put in place constraints on ethnic Chinese in Indonesia in terms of their ability to express their culture or study their language or even use Chinese characters on imported products. So during that period, although Indonesia continued to maintain non-aligned status, it shifted much more closely to the US and indeed, as I just said, had no diplomatic relations with China. In the post-Cold War period, and particularly since the advent of democracy in Indonesia, there's been an opening up of space and a huge improvement in relations with China. On the US side, I think it's fair to say that Indonesia has often regarded the US as a distracted partner, one that is often pulled away and has this attention diverted to various other parts of the world. And in the pre-Trump era, the US also pushed quite hard for more trade liberalization, which has never found a strong support base in Indonesia. And importantly, and I think we'll turn to this more in the discussion, Indonesia also has diverged from the US in terms of matters of global policy, particularly the issue of Palestine, the invasion of Iraq, the global war on terror. All of these things were a divergence of views and have acted as something of a constraint on the relationship. So fast forward to today, we're coming up on the last year of a 10-year term from President Joko Widodo, who's known as Jokowi, in which he has pursued ever closer relations with China. Jokowi is Indonesia's first president in the democratic period who does not come from the elite. He came into office with a very specific mandate that he was going to improve the lives of ordinary Indonesians. And that has framed very, very tightly his foreign policy. Every country pursues a foreign policy that benefits their domestic interests. But I would say in the Jokowi era, that's been especially salient, and he's been very pragmatic. And he's leaned very heavily on Chinese investment to fulfill those goals, particularly in building out infrastructure to connect Indonesia's 17,000 islands. He's been to China, more than twice as many times as he's been to the United States. He's hosted government leaders and business leaders from China on a consistent basis and frequently sent his cabinet there. And it's paid off. Indonesia is the largest recipient of Chinese foreign direct investment from the period of 2018 to 2020. But Jokowi's had to do this while managing some domestic suspicions of China. Indonesia, as I mentioned earlier, is 87% Muslim country. You have the history of the coup and many Indonesians who would view China as communist, therefore being atheist and subject to mistrust. So he's had to manage that domestically. And then he's also had to manage the fact that he wants to maintain a close relationship with the United States and continue to access the maximum amount of economic benefits possible, and position Indonesia in such a way that it can be the recipient of investments that are seeking to move away from China to diversify geopolitical risk and the supply chain disruptions that many countries experienced during COVID. So in doing this, Jokowi has relied, I would say, on a mix of approaches that have been consistent throughout Indonesia's foreign policy history, but recalibrated. First, I mentioned Indonesia's free and active foreign policy. That's continued to be a core part of Indonesia's approach. And we saw this very much on display when Indonesia hosted the G20 in 2022, where Jokowi invested a considerable amount of time in keeping all of the players at the table. He traveled to Russia, he traveled to Ukraine, he traveled to the G7 members, and really made the argument, especially to other middle powers at the G20, that the US and China should not ruin this platform for emerging economies, that it was important to maintain multilateral discussions where those economies had a voice. And he was successfully able to do that. I think it's also reflected in Indonesia's decision not to join the BRICS when they expanded their membership earlier this year, which was the subject of fairly healthy debate in Jakarta. But ultimately, the decision was made that in order to pursue maximum flexibility and freedom and to avoid being pigeonholed into a camp that might take sides, Indonesia would opt out for now. Second, and Kapil mentioned this at the outset, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has been a bulwark of Indonesia's strategy for engaging with great powers. ASEAN is the 10, soon to be 11, including East Timor, Southeast Asian countries. It's a consensus-based organization that collectively is 770 million people, and has been used by the countries in the region to engage with great powers to increase voice and influence and impact, to diversify risk of confronting them on behaviors that may not be welcome in the region, and also leverage to fill the space that great power rivalries have left in terms of multilateral cooperation in Southeast Asia. Because China and Japan have a rivalry, China and India, the US and China, ASEAN has been able to position itself at the center of multilateral conversations within the region in a way that has been beneficial to Indonesia. And third, I'll just briefly mention, very important though, Indonesia sought to boost its own strategic and economic significance to both the US and China to strengthen its bargaining position. Jokowi's done this through a number of means, including, you may have seen the headlines about Indonesia's critical minerals policy, by mandating that minerals have to be processed within Indonesia. He's attracted a lot of Chinese investment into that sector, as well as manufacturing investment from Korea, China, and others for EVs, thus generating jobs for Indonesia, but also making the most of a critical commodity within the strategic competition between the US and China. There is an election coming up. I think we'll see a lot of continuity in these three different approaches, no matter who the winner is, but we might see some differences in emphasis between the US and China. I'm happy to talk more about that later, Kat, if that's of interest.
Absolutely, and actually I do want to just ask you a second question before we go to Jonathan. You talked about how Indonesia is trying to straddle between the two countries and not pick sides. How is that playing out with what's going on in the Middle East and in Europe with the two conflicts or wars?
Yeah, so on the Europe side, Indonesia's steadfastly refused to, quote unquote, take sides between Russia and Ukraine. But as I said, really invested a considerable amount of diplomatic capital in bringing the G20 members together, despite that huge divide within the membership about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the Middle East, Indonesia has had a long and abiding loyalty to Palestine that dates back to the 1950s. The first Asia-Africa conference was in Bandung. Indonesia is very proud of this. And Palestinian self-determination was one of the items on the agenda that they view as being unresolved. On top of that, it's a Muslim-majority country. There's a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian people, and it has a lot more resonance than, I would say, other issues like, for example, the Uyghurs or the treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Palestine is top of mind for many Indonesians. So the government has condemned the violence against civilians. They have sent aid. I think that's one of the factors that may change depending on the election result in terms of how much more proactive or activist Indonesia becomes on that issue on the international stage, and depending, of course, on how the situation continues to unfold.
Yeah, I'm sure we will get into that, and I can see that people have responded to my challenge of questions, and very interesting questions are coming through right now. Jonathan, we're going to go from look east to look west and talk where, first of all, I want to say if you recognize his face, Jonathan has been all over news talking about what's going on in the Middle East. He's one of the Atlantic Council's top experts on the Middle East, so we're really delighted to have you and hear your perspective as well. South Asian countries like Pakistan and India have continued to deepen their strategic partnerships with the GCC, and those relationships are slowly impacting the dynamics in the Middle East. So the question for you is, what are the Middle East partners and partnerships like the GCC looking for from countries like Pakistan? What must Pakistan policymakers keep in mind as they try to adapt and retain their strategic relevance and strengthen ties with the Middle East while competing with other South Asian regional players, or you could say player with S in the parens?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Cap and Uzair. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today. I actually was fascinated by what Meredith was saying because I do not have expertise in Indonesia, even a little. I can find it on the map correctly, but it's about my limits, maybe a little more. But the type of policy that Indonesia has pursued, as Meredith has outlined it, is similar, frankly, to where I'm going to start with Saudi Arabia, because it is the biggest player in the region, the things that you're hearing come out of Riyadh, which is that Riyadh very much is determined to no longer be in anybody's camp. It is determined to be non-aligned, to pursue its own independent foreign policy, not only of the US or of China, but frankly even of the Middle East. Now, that comes with a bit of an asterisk because it wants to be independent, but it does want the rest of the Arab region to follow what it does. It views itself in this new world of multipolarity as the central pole in the Arab world. Rightly or wrongly, that is how it views itself. The challenge is, and this is where it's going to be challenging for a number of countries, including Pakistan, that have had historical and deep relationships with GCC countries, but especially with Saudi Arabia, is that even more so than what I think how it was described in terms of Indonesia, I'm among those who doesn't actually think Saudi Arabia has much of a foreign policy anymore. I think they have almost a singular domestic policy right now that is driven to achieving Vision 2030 accomplishments. And so everything within the foreign policy camp that they do, absolutely, is completely aligned to, does this get us closer to diversifying our economy, no longer being reliant on hydrocarbons, moving to a situation where we are a financial capital in the region, and we can talk about what that means vis-a-vis the UAE, moving toward a tourism capital, moving towards a sports capital. There's been a lot of talk, right, about Emirati investment. If folks saw the World Cup news, that they will probably get 2034. I understand, and I'm not going to, it is a longer conversation about whether this is sports washing or not. What I can tell you is that from their perspective, they don't see this first as sports washing. What they see it as is this will bring revenue. This will bring tourism. This will bring dollars that diversifies away from hydrocarbons. And if it helps them from a reputational benefit long term, great. But that's not actually what's driving this. And so I think the problem, though, becomes Saudi Arabia is not Qatar, which has, I think, the second highest GDP per capita in the world right now, after, I believe, Monaco. It is not the Emirates, which has, about 9.5 million people that live there, but only about a little over 1 million are citizens and Emiratis. Saudi Arabia has, a little over 30 million people. It is desperately trying to turn what is a much, much bigger ship than any of the smaller Gulf states in a way that competes against them. And for Saudi Arabia, the break-even point from oil revenue that's required is about somewhere in the mid-70s. But that's just to keep where they've been doing. What they really need, and what they will hear from them, is closer to really probably the mid-80s, to have enough financial revenue long-term to make the type of diversification investments that they're looking for. Now, this affects Pakistan greatly, just as it affects a number of the regional countries. Jordan, Egypt especially, if folks are following what is a dire financial crisis in Egypt. The Palestinians, the Omanis. For years, there was a view, Lebanon certainly, there was a view that Saudi largesse would provide for many of these countries, and for years it did. And Riyadh has made a decision very explicitly that it is no longer willing to be the bank of most of the countries in not just the Arab world, but of the Muslim world as a whole. And so that is having, I think, a really big effect. You see it certainly, and my folks in the region, I know it, where Jordan and Egypt are. It's created significant holes in some of the budgets that what used to be accounted for of financial support is no longer coming in. The Saudis think they cannot afford it anymore, that every dollar they have has to be reinvested back into their own country. Otherwise, they will not get ahead to where they want to go. Now, some of the smaller states still have some capacity to support, but again, the Emiratis are preparing for what I think is going to be, over the long term, an intra-regional conflict with the Saudis over competition for a lot of the same non-hydrocarbon type of revenue-generating efforts. The Qataris are so small, it's slightly different. And so that doesn't mean that for Pakistan there won't be support for the region, but it's not going to be close to what it is. Where there's an opportunity is the Saudis have also become more transactional than ever before. They see the Chinese model and appreciate it in that it's transactional, it's independent, they don't have to get involved in every issue. And so if Pakistan has diversification in their economy and something new to offer, Saudi Arabia will be a willing country to hear it out and possibly to invest and have the FDI go both ways, but it has to generate revenue for Saudi Arabia. The last thing I'll kind of say about the Gulf, which has been the focus, is, you know, the one problem, especially for the Saudis, but this actually goes for all the countries, and we're seeing it potentially play out in very real time. I haven't checked the news yet in the last half hour. The spread of a conflict like we're seeing right now between Israel and Hamas, if it spreads to Hezbollah, to regional states, the Houthis obviously are a real concern. Everything that Saudi Arabia wants to do is dependent on security. Not security for security's sake, but security because without security, there's not enough political risk insurance in the world to allow them to diversify the economy in the way they want, because nobody will provide the FDI that's necessary to move away from oil. What that means then is that the types of conflicts that we're seeing now play out, they will also be particularly appreciative of any partners who can help play a role in either mediating this, in settling this, in calming this. I do not believe Saudi Arabia cares where the peace comes from, as long as there's security and tranquility for them to do what they need to do domestically. And I think it's in that context that Pakistan wants to look at Saudi Arabia to see what can we offer in a very transactional manner, whether it's on the, you know, they're probably not going to be a mediator in this conflict, but more generally, can they have a role in the international relations, because they can have a role in certain aspects of economic development? Is there a role in manufacturing? Is there a role, whatever it is, I think that's going to be the way in through Saudi Arabia, and then the broader GCC in the years to come.
It's fascinating. You're talking about how Saudi Arabia primarily is trying to be more independent, similar to Indonesia, and the move of Muslim countries going in that direction. One country you did not talk about, which I'd like to ask you before we go to Mosharraf, is Iran, which sits outside the GCC. How does Iran view its foreign policy with South Asia and Pakistan and the broader South Asia region? And how does that future relationship between Pakistan and Iran impact Pakistan's broader foreign policy interests, let's say, outside of the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, look, obviously, Pakistan and Iran have a fairly contentious historic relationship. In part, that's been tied to Pakistan's close relationship with Saudi Arabia, the natural animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think, dragged Pakistan in. But not only. I mean, there was issues for a number of years related to what the Iranians will call security challenges stemming from Pakistan. The truth is, for Pakistan, there's a bit of an opportunity. It's not that China actually managed the rapprochement that we saw between Saudi Arabia and Iran a couple of months ago, 6 months ago. That had been long in the works. The Iraqis and the Omanis actually did most of the work, but the Chinese did get it over the line. I think that there is a broader dynamic at play here related to Iran. And I don't know for the Pakistanis that the relationship is going to be as meaningful with Iran directly, though I'm sure, with calm in the region, there's opportunities, especially if Saudi Arabia and Iran are not at each other's throats, literally or figuratively. But with China, it seems to create another opportunity because of where that trilateral relationship between Pakistan, China, and Iran may go. Iran right now, there's a very big focus. I think I'm sure people have heard about the $6 billion that the U.S. is trying to block, that Qatar is holding. Look, I'm not saying, without taking sides on that particular issue, again, another conversation, I'm not saying it's not important. It is, but it's a red herring. Right now, Iran is getting about $80 billion a year from illicit oil sales, almost all to China. So when you talk about an energy crisis, especially in places like Pakistan, the opportunity, and obviously there was a gas pipeline that hasn't been finished, which we'll talk about in a second. The opportunity from an energy and a low, cheap cost source of energy may be there actually right now. Now the problem is, obviously, it's all in massive violation of U.S. sanctions.
Right.
And how you square that circle and what it is Pakistan prioritizes in terms of its relationships, which I'll defer to the many people in the room who are Pakistan experts, I can't talk to. But for Iran, Iran is a willing partner. Iran needs revenue desperately. They're selling at a massive discount. But going after that, the Chinese deny it. I understand. But what you're seeing is the Iranians ship the oil largely off the coast of Malaysia. It's blended with crude that is not Iranian or off the coast of Singapore. And then it goes forward to various markets, most heavily China. There's other opportunities there. But there's going to have to be a choice made in a way that I think most countries don't want to make a choice. And they can do it without upsetting China, which is probably the big thing, but they can't do this without upsetting the U.S. And so, look, every country's foreign policy is a reflection of its domestic policy. I completely agree with that. Saudi even more so. But Pakistan is going to have to decide what's its most compelling and urgent need, if it's the energy markets, which obviously is the fuel for everything else in your society, if it's better relations that it thinks it can actually have with the U.S., if it's better relations with the GCC. But it's probably not going to be in a position to have all of these. And so there's going to have to be a decision made in Islamabad about how to prioritize in a way that maybe Saudi Arabia doesn't have to just because of its economic might, in a way Indonesia may not have to because they started, it sounds like, this process so many years ago and are already in a much more fluid position to be able to do what they want. It is worth noting, Saudi Arabia also didn't align with the BRICS yet. There was an invitation, they haven't actually responded. Iran immediately was like, yes, right? The invitation for Iran to come to the BRICS was not because of Iran's great economic might. It was largely from Russia and China about the U.S. That's the triangle, or frankly, it's probably a much bigger, hexagon Pakistan's going to have to navigate as we go forward.
Fascinating, and more and more questions are coming through on this, and we'll get to some of these questions after we hear from Mosharraf. And I'm going to give you some easy questions, just because we had a fabulous dinner last night, and I know you're capable of answering easy questions. Let's go into Israel-Hamas right off the bat.
My last visit to D.C. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. What are your general thoughts on the conflict, and how will countries like Pakistan manage this very complicated relationship with the Middle East and U.S. and Western powers?
Thanks, Cap. You've asked me for my thoughts on what Israel is doing in Gaza, and I think we can't. I think it's unfair to speak of that without referencing the 7th of October. But I also think it's wrong to pretend that October 7th happened in a vacuum with no intergenerational provocation. So where does the thread actually end is the question for the ages that Middle East experts, much more capable than myself, kind of have to struggle with in this town and in Islamabad and everywhere else. But the depopulation of Gaza, or at least North Gaza, is which I think we're watching happen in real time, I think is a personal horror for me. I think it is for a lot of people, including I think a lot of Israelis. So the human tragedy of this, I think, trumps all other aspects of it. But I think to immediately take this from the personal and how I feel about it to what it means, not just for Pakistan, but I think for Indonesia, for Saudi Arabia, for Pakistan, is the fundamental driver of what Saudi Arabia is doing and what it's been doing vis-a-vis the normalization process with Israel is really about de-risking for the objective of achieving Vision 2030, which is principally an economic play, and it's an economic play that has a 50-year vision. So after Vision 2035, there's going to be 40, probably 45 and onwards. And so the purpose of that normalization process is to serve Vision 2030. Now, can any Vision 2030, the next stage of Indonesia's growth, the next stage of what Saudi Arabia is going to look like, and whatever comes out of the political chaos and disequilibrium in Pakistan. And I want to address that momentarily because I thought it was really interesting that foreign policy, of course, is a reflection of what a country is wanting to do inside. And so the big question that I can answer right away for Pakistan is the reason that Pakistan's foreign policy isn't always clear, although the instincts of the Pakistani elite are the same as the instincts in Jakarta or in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, which is we want to maximize the number of options that we have. We don't want to be told what to do. If we want to buy Iranian oil, for example, we should be able to do that, and the U.S. should treat us the way they treat India. When India, plays, I think, more than footsie. I think it's second base going in third with the Russians. But they get a complete, the reason you guys giggle is because nobody talks about what India is doing with Russia. That's where Pakistan would like to be. That's where Saudi Arabia, I think, is beginning to get to. That's where Indonesia, I think, found itself in 2022 at the G20, is to try and establish that autonomy. The reason Pakistan can't establish that autonomy is because of domestic, for lack of a better term, disequilibrium. The fact that the most popular political agents and actors in Pakistan are removed from office or jailed with no real consequences down the road for those people that are engaged in constitutional violations. And the fact that it's never really clear, although it's always clear, who's in charge in Islamabad. So that domestic fissure reflects itself in Pakistan not being able to understand Vision 2030 via Saudi Arabia, or not being able to find, despite very deep relations with Indonesia, not being able to find a smooth channel for plugging into ASEAN and what I think that market offers to Pakistani exporters, for example. That's a topic that we've been talking about. So the big challenge, bringing this back to what's happening in North Gaza in particular, is that it's going to become very difficult for the Indonesian elite to sell the idea of de-risking over a long period of time and developing a relationship with Tel Aviv when the people of Indonesia feel outraged by the very mention of Israel, having consumed, it's only a month so far, just less than a month. We might be looking at a year of these images being consumed by young Indonesians, by young Saudis, and especially by young Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Indian Muslims, all over the world. That consumption is going to make the distance between the instinct of the elites in these countries to want to de-risk, to want to engage with countries, to want to trade with them, to want to benefit from the vast and frankly globally superior technologies that companies and government agencies in Israel offer to these countries. But that offer cannot be at the cost of domestic stability. And I think that the big question for His Royal Highness in Riyadh, for the Indonesians, even for countries like Morocco, which are much smaller and much further ahead in terms of feeding their people, educating their people, as compared to a country like Pakistan, is there a tipping point when efforts to normalize and to have that de-risking sort of profile globally and regionally comes into direct conflict with people's sense of right and wrong, people's sense of identity, the kind of personal, deep personal grievance and sadness. I'm too old to be angry, but if you're a young person, and Pakistan has a median age of 23, so the deep anger and resentment that this is producing, I think that's a commonality that a lot of these middle power Muslim majority countries are gonna contend with. And I think what's interesting by contrast is a country like India, which has a different set of challenges on that front, but which over the last 10, 15 years has really clearly aligned itself politically in a different direction than maybe the old Nehruvian path might have led them to.
There's no question about that. I mean, this morning when I was skimming through news articles, there's been a lot of articles talking about how protesters are forcing the elite to reshape their foreign policy to the Middle East, and Pakistan is not immune from that, nor is Indonesia. I have 2 or 3 more questions for you because from the perspective that you're bringing, and I think for the benefit of the audience and those online, you should give your perspective of how you're seeing these things because of your unique background. I think that helps people appreciate what you're saying. Has Pakistan's approach to what's going on in the Middle East, has that been shaped or changed by the reaction during the Ukraine-Russian war, when the former prime minister traveled to Moscow at the outset of the war, and it really did cause Islamabad a lot of diplomatic headaches. Did Pakistan's elite, did they learn something from that? Did they change course? What are your thoughts about the fallout from that trip to Moscow?
That's a great question. I think that I'll go back to the instinct of the elite to want to not be. I think the big lesson learning in Pakistan was Turkey, and especially the Davutoglu Turkey, right? The kind of, we don't want to have any active conflicts. We have disagreements with countries, but we have to have those disagreements have to play out on dinner tables and boardroom tables and not through conflict. And we also don't want to communicate through the press. So if we have a problem, there may be stuff that's happening in the mainstream news media, but we want to have a relationship with those countries that sorts those out. I think when you have that instinct, but the pressures of populism overriding that instinct is when you run into, and you don't have the muscularity economically, for example, or in terms of natural resources that in Indonesia or Saudi Arabia does, then you end up where Pakistan was at the end of February 2022 and throughout March, and frankly, it's been in that tailspin from that time onwards. And that is that Pakistan is very clearly the Pakistani elite, the Pakistani military, they're not confused about needing to not align fully with China or fully with the US, needing to maintain a reasonable relationship with the Russians, but they recognize that in many ways, Pakistan's natural affinity and natural sort of alignment would be with Ukraine, given its own troubles with a larger, more powerful, richer country that doesn't see its existence foundationally as being legitimate. So, of course, what I'm saying is Pakistan is to India what Ukraine is to Russia, and so that's not unclear to Pakistanis, but in the larger geopolitical game, I think Pakistani elites don't want to be aligned with one or the other. And I think that the trip to Russia, ill-advised, was because of an overexuberance of wanting to express that autonomy without necessarily having done the necessary homework in terms of a conversation with DC, conversations with Moscow itself, frankly with Kiev. All of those ended up happening after his visit. A lot of folks here would recall that there was a lot of effort to demonstrate, some degree of alignment and empathy with what the Ukrainians were going through immediately after the trip. That wasn't only external pressure, that was also the internal drive by the Pakistani elites as wanting to be, like the Indonesians and the Saudis, not visibly on one or another side. I don't know whether that experience has taught the Pakistani elite any lessons, because the fundamentals of what is Pakistani dysfunction, as I said, is not about its foreign policy. It's about how matters of who is in charge are resolved back home. So as long as this dynamic and disequilibrium between Rawalpindi and between Islamabad, between populist or popular leaders and those that tend to know better in Pakistan, that's what's really fueling or driving the absence of lesson learning. So until that competition isn't resolved in a sustainable and predictable way, and this is something that alludes to points that have been made, I think, in every panel we've had over the last day and a half. Until that isn't resolved, then the ability to learn lessons is really secondary, because a lot of the foreign policy pronouncements or behaviors that you'll see will be a product of that competition. And of course, the best example of that is the narrative deployed, the narrative deployed by Imran Khan upon his ouster, that he was removed because the Americans wanted him gone. I don't want to get back into that, as many of you would know. That's been a debate that really has consumed Pakistan's politics, and I think a lot of the civility in our politics over the last year and a half. But I think now it's also consumed a lot of human rights and civil rights and freedoms back home. So one of the warnings that I've been trying to caution Pakistani elites about in the last couple of weeks, I've tried to write about what's happening in Gaza, not from the perspective of the outrage that is taking place in terms of how Palestinians are being killed every day, including children and babies and women and innocent people in hospitals and apartment buildings, but also, and more importantly for Pakistani elites, in terms of what this dynamic will do once again to the dynamic at home. And so if the Pakistani elite try to make decisions about this that are reflective of the same dualities and disparities that Russia-Ukraine represented and other often foreign policy choices represent, then Pakistan will be sleepwalking into yet another domestic/foreign affairs crisis.
So the way that you look at what's happening in Gaza, do the Pakistani elite look at it the same way as they deport hundreds of thousands of Afghanis from Pakistan to other countries? How do you think they manage that duality?
Well, let me first comment on that in terms of how I feel about it. I myself am a muhajir and a migrant multiple times over. My family came to Pakistan as South Asian Muslims looking for freedom and stability and security in a free homeland. That's where a lot of us, I think, should have some common ground with Israelis. And so, but I think that's the extent of that parallel working. The Afghans that are being evicted technically are supposed to be those that are not supposed to be in Pakistan. But to me, if Pakistan's very foundation was as a home and a safe haven for people that didn't want to be where they're from, because they were scared, because they didn't have the right opportunities, then to me it's inconceivable that Pakistan would be run by people that would not want Afghans in Pakistan. So that's my personal view. Now, in terms of what this decision reflects, I think principally it reflects being fed up with the Afghan Taliban. This is a reaction to the Afghan Taliban's continued, I think, deep relationship with the TTP, which to us in Pakistan is the world's most important terrorist group. Why innocent Afghan men, women, and children have to be removed from relative security in Pakistan. And I say relative because it's not Beverly Hills, they're not living La Vida Loca in Pakistan, but they are living a better and safer life than they would back home. To my mind, evicting those people who, again, to my mind, and I think for a lot of friends here, represent the most powerful stock of public diplomacy and demonstration of what is truly Pakistani, which is virtue and goodness and hospitality and warmth and generosity. Those are innately Pakistani values. And so when the Pakistani Republic decides to evict even one Afghan refugee, what to say of thousands and potentially hundreds of thousands, I think it defeats and diminishes Pakistan's standing for itself. It also, frankly, undermines the aspirations of the Pakistani elite to be that autonomous middle power. Middle powers tend to be extremely sensitive. I don't like the term sport washing because I don't think that's what it is, but I'm also very partial to Vision 2030 and to Prime Minister MBS. But I think that a lot of the effort that these elites are making in places like Bangladesh, Indonesia, I'd say Poland is another, I think, important middle power, not in the Muslim world, decidedly, and Saudi Arabia. They're very interested in showing the world their best face. And so when Pakistan does this, it's taking one of the things that is its best face and flipping it around. It's denying 40 plus years of goodness and hospitality, for the large part. There's lots of individual bad stories. They're refugees, and it's been a long conflict. And Pakistan is not a great place, even for Pakistanis or Pakistani women, for example. But by and large, the story of the Pakistani state and the Afghan refugee is a good story that Pakistan should be able to tell. But when Pakistani elites decide to do things like this, and this is not the first time, there's been an increasing pressure over the last decade and a half. A lot of that comes, frankly, since I'm in Washington, I think it's fair to say, a lot of it also comes from the finger-wagging tone of the U.S., consistent U.S. administrations, basically telling Pakistan to do everything that the Americans wanted in Afghanistan without any sort of understanding or empathy about how difficult some of those things were, and the position that Pakistan was starting from, having been that position, partly because of the Pakistani elites having listened to friends in Washington, D.C. A generation prior to that. So I think it absolutely makes no sense for Afghan refugees to be evicted in this way. I'm not, like I said, I think the parallel with Israel and Palestine doesn't quite work because they are foreign nationals. However, 78% of Afghan refugees were born in Pakistan. So if any of those people who are official UNHCR recognized refugees are removed, like I said, to me, that's an affront to me personally, and certainly doesn't make sense if Pakistan is interested in seriously, placing itself before the world as a serious middle power.
So, first of all, fabulous comments. I think we broke the record, so our panel holds a record for questions asked online, so thank you. Mainly because I think what all three of you have been talking about are really relevant and people can actually relate to. But one common question that's come up a few times, and I think when we have a panel or a discussion like this, and this is the fault of the moderator, I have to admit, is I didn't define what a middle power is. It's kind of like, what does global south mean? So I'd love for the three of you to define what is a middle power, and what does it mean to be a middle power, and how does a middle power navigate this time where you are picking sides in all of these current conflicts? We'll start with you, Meredith.
say, I think Mosharraf is writing an extensive paper on this, but
I actually have a different question for him, too, because there's
I'll
an
take
election coming up.
I'll take the opening salvo. I would say, first off, Indonesia aspires to be a great power. And when you're talking about Saudi's 2030 vision, I should have mentioned Indonesia's 2045 golden vision, which is to be developed country status at that point, which would make it one of the largest economies in the world. And it certainly sees itself as being a global player and one that's on a rising trajectory in that regard. But in terms of what is a middle power, in my view, it's a power that has a level of strategic autonomy, has the ability to exercise influence in venues, either regionally or globally, and has the ability to influence international outcomes. The Lowy Institute, which is a really fantastic Australian think tank, has done a ranking which goes into this in more detail across military, economic, diplomatic. And according to their rankings, Indonesia is sort of solidly in the middle of how they evaluate this, as is Vietnam, interestingly to me. Because without going into their methodology, in my view, Indonesia has a lot more weight on the international stage by virtue of its size and also its geography. I mentioned Indonesia's investment in building out its strategic and economic importance to the U.S. and China. Some of that is the virtue of being an archipelago nation that is geographically distant from China and very strategically important for global trade and militaries as well in terms of transit through the region. So it was a bit of a meandering response, but I think the biggest piece of that, Cap, is the strategic autonomy of it.
Which is also being harder to define these days, right? What is strategic autonomy? Jonathan?
So, because I actually agree with really how Meredith defined this. I think it works well. The one thing I will add is that I think there's also a requirement that for the middle powers that they not be dependent on other countries. So what I mean by that is every country has trade, every country has relations, every country brokers things that they don't have that they can import, things that they can import. But I think for a middle power, it needs to be able to have its sufficient own financial and security base, whether it's imported or not, and to be able to afford to have that base in a way that they don't have to rely on others to support them. So that doesn't mean that if there's a massive war, you're not going to get reliance and people asking either the U.S. or China to come support, which China is not going to do. But the U.S., for some of the Middle East countries, might. But it does mean that they should be able to have enough security capacity to manage the what I'll call minor incursions, minor missile strikes, minor launches. So I think they're working toward this, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, but it is a real challenge for them if the Houthis decide to consistently strike, for instance, the kingdom. And it is why Saudi Arabia got so upset for the Abqaiq attacks, that it felt like the U.S. wasn't there, and we can have this debate somewhere else whether the U.S. did enough for both them and the Emirates than during the Biden administration. But there's, I think, a fundamental responsibility that they have to be able to provide some of their own protection, even if it's through U.S. assets. Similarly, I think economically, they have to be able to engage. If you're taking massive IMF loans, I think it's very hard to say you are a middle power. And this is something Egypt is going through, which has been, I would argue, historically a middle power for a lot of years, but is losing significantly that influence because it can't afford, even within its own country, to manage its financial debts, its financial crisis. Once you're dependent on somebody else, financially, economically, not through normal trade, but actually for support, just to fill budget gaps. Once you're dependent on somebody else, even for the most minor security issues, it's hard for you to say that you're a middle power because you don't have the opportunity or ability to project into whatever region you're in your own power.
So does I'm going to slightly tweak the question for you, Mosharraf, but does COVID change what a definition of a middle power is? Is there different levels now? Because personally, the way I looked at the rise of middle powers of the global south was coming out of the COVID pandemic, where countries soon realized about the dependency, about how 2 or 3 countries really dominated the supply chains, the ingredients, the vaccines, access to vaccines. And then this is where you started seeing countries really puff out their chest and say, no more. So where does COVID and pandemic and healthcare fall within your definition? Because both of you really use military. But what about healthcare? I got a different question for him. I just want to quick, because I listening to both of you, and it's a very defense-oriented.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important question, and certainly Indonesia reacted to its inability to procure vaccines by doubling down on developing its own pharmaceutical manufacturing industry, which has been a priority for quite some time, but not an easy problem to solve, given particularly access to key ingredients for the pharmaceutical sector, most of which Indonesia sources from China or India, actually. I think one of the key areas of dissension that emerged in the G20 meetings in Indonesia as well was around what actions the international community would or would not take to diversify research and development and vaccine manufacturing capacity. It's still an unresolved issue. I think it's one where we'll continue to see that discussion in Brazil's year and probably South Africa's for exactly the reasons that you've outlined, Cap. But I think it's in some ways a more challenging issue to fix even than the question of military prowess.
Yeah.
I think, look, so as the one person on the stage who's not actually focused on the global south, so I do look forward to you defining that for me, because I still don't know what it means.
Dang it.
Yeah, it comes back around. We don't have to do it in this time. I think it's interesting because I think for most of the Saudi, the Emirates, other countries in the region that we would think of as middle powers in the Middle East, COVID actually was a bit of the straw that broke the camel's back, because I think COVID actually drove them to the strategic autonomy.
Right.
There was a view, I think, almost inherent within a lot of the Arab world that it had to have a level of dependence on the U.S. for security, on trade with China, even as it might not have wanted it. But because of the way the U.S. shut down, because of the way China shut down, what came out from a number of Middle East states was that we actually can't survive and be okay on our own and do this our own way. And it looked different in a couple of different places, especially within the GCC, about what that meant. Some of them actually got together in a much more meaningful way than they have. And I've got to be honest, it's interesting because the GCC, there's not an organization today in which there is less trust between members right now than in the GCC. But it had this impact of driving some of them together into this idea that they had to have greater strategic autonomy, and that, I think, is part of what is necessary to be a middle power. They don't have the same, for the most part, pharmaceutical base or manufacturing. That just hasn't been a focus. But it should certainly have an impact on how they think of themselves and their own capabilities.
February 11th is the next election, and millions of Pakistanis are going to be going to the polls. So, Mosharraf, how do you see the elections impacting Pakistan's foreign policy, if it does? And how do they view themselves when it comes to, as a country? There were a lot of questions on this. Is Pakistan really a middle power? But I'd like to ask the question, since I think we all concede that a lot of foreign policy is driven by domestic politics. So really doesn't matter what we think of Pakistan being a middle power, it's how do Pakistanis think of themselves when it comes to foreign policy and their role. And
So I
will we
think-
see that on February 11th?
So I think the first thing I would do is separate out the Pakistani elites from the Pakistani people.
And define, what, there was one question is, what do you mean by Pakistani elite?
So, global
throw
South,
that.
let me start with Global South, Middle Power.
Okay.
I think Pakistani elites, by Pakistani elites, I mean people that are in charge of making decisions that have the control of either capital or political decision making in a way that ordinary people don't. You know, one of the, I think, typical elite responses to the question of the Pakistani saying, well, what do you mean by the elite, is people are uncomfortable about being elites. And so, you know, if you speak English, you have friends at Aitchison College, even if you didn't go there yourself, you are within 1.5 degree of power. You are at least elite adjacent. So the Pakistani elite is, you know, in and of itself, I think, the people that make decisions for Pakistan. At the top of that mountain is the military leadership, but hand in hand, in lockstep with them, are key political leaders, key leaders of religious organizations, and most importantly, and the one that gets ignored a lot of the times, are Pakistan's sort of rent-seeking capitalists. The reason that they are hand in hand in lockstep with them is that unlike India or Saudi Arabia, especially post-Ritz-Carlton, Pakistan does not have a competitive, globally or locally competitive elite. It has an elite that defines itself through the extraction of rents that it secures through its relationships, both through kinship and through transactions, with those that sign off on things and make decisions. I don't want to go much deeper into that, but I think it's not confusing unless you're self-conscious about being an elite.
Yeah, and that came up in a previous panel yesterday as well, same definition.
Now on the reason I want to make that distinction also is because how the elite see themselves in Pakistan and how the Pakistani 23-year-old sees herself are, I think, two vastly different propositions. There's a reason why leaders like Zulfikar Ali Bhutto 50 years ago and Imran Khan today, and others in between, including Nawaz Sharif at various points in time, especially when he was younger, the reason they're able to animate and activate the imagination of young people is because there is a inherent, in the very definition of what Pakistan is supposed to be, an aspiration to be a great power, not just a middle power. And I think that's the most interesting thing about being a middle power is nobody wants to be a middle power. Countries that are middle powers want to be great powers. They want to be globally influential, not just regionally. I think the most epic example of that is India in the 1990s, when it was a middle power. India is no longer a middle power. It's a debate or a discussion that I have with many friends. India is now essentially what you might call a superpower, a great power. I know that makes people in the greatest power uncomfortable because it's just supposed to be the U.S. with China coming up the ranks. But I think you think of Russia, you think of India, and frankly, you think of Japan and Germany in particular. Those are beyond middle power countries. I'm going to come back to the election in a second, but just to go to what makes a middle power, I think you have to have relevance beyond your borders. You have to have agency to act beyond your borders, and you have the power to enact that agency. That's where I think the security and military prowess comes in. Pakistan is no longer a middle power, even an aspiring one in the minds of its elites, because of the IMF programs, because it's basically hollowed itself out to the point that it really has no economic autonomy whatsoever. Literally, the third and fourth layer of the tax code is now being negotiated and defined by 28-year-old economists that work about a mile from here. So when you have that degree of agency that you cede or concede yourself in order to keep your rent-seeking capitalists happy, that's primarily why, then you end up losing that capacity to be a middle power. But because of its overwhelming, comparatively, military prowess, the fact that it's a nuclear weapon state, and the size of the country, it's 250 million people, in any conversation about any major issue on the planet, it becomes relevant. We saw, I think, maybe 6 days ago, Munir Akram, who otherwise, including myself, is reviled by many, but criticized by some. I don't revile him, but I certainly am not a fan. But he spoke as the Pakistan representative, and it had, it made a difference in global sort of news cycles. And so that relevance of its agency as a big Muslim country, as a nuclear power, I think makes it cling to that middle power table. The young Pakistani sees Pakistan as a potential great power. All of Pakistani poetry and Pakistani imagery, you can call it mythology or whatever you want to call it, but the story that Pakistanis have been told of what Pakistan should be consistently for the entirety of its existence has been that it has a great destiny. I don't think the Pakistani elite believe that anymore, and I think that dichotomy goes back to what, this, what's happening in the Middle East, how that influences and how quickly the Pakistani elite splits on big foreign policy questions, Russia, Ukraine, I think eventually probably this one too. And so the election is a huge opportunity for Pakistan to actually resolve that dichotomy by saying, we're just going to put the people of Pakistan in charge, whatever they actually choose, and let them make the mistakes that they need to make through their elected representatives, and we're here as the military to back up whatever the government decides. I think no reasonable observer of Pakistan believes that that's the kind of election we're going to have. I think it's going to be an election in which the military continues to be the principal determinant and arbiter of the last mile of decision making, especially when it comes to relationships with the United States, with China, with India, with Saudi Arabia. And so if that's going to be the case, then there may be, the benefit of that may be short to medium term stability because everybody knows who's making decisions, and those decisions are reasonably well thought out. We're giving them the benefit of the doubt in this scenario. But eventually, the incentive for a political actor to stand up and say, hey, you weren't elected to make these decisions. You were trained and financed to keep terrorists outside our borders, to keep from Narendra Modi from sort of flexing his muscles on our borders. And so you don't get to decide for us, and we want to decide. And that opportunity that the military creates for any political actor, it doesn't have to be Imran Khan, anyone that is outside the inner circle of the military is naturally incentivized to stand up and oppose, especially on big picture items, and especially in an era of social media and populism, things like, I go back to what's happening in North Gaza, that will become the fuel for somebody to counter or oppose whatever plans, real and believed or fake, in terms of middle power aspirations that Pakistan might have.
So we have a few minutes left, and I want to just piggyback off the elections, because I don't think a lot of people realize how important and pivotal 2024 is going to be really for the world in terms of elections. There's, I believe, more than half the world is going to the polls next year. And you can have a seismic shift in how countries are going to start dealing with each other, because it's on the backs of what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the Middle East. So for everybody here, and keeping to the theme of talking about middle powers, how do you see 2024, the elections, generally speaking, around the world, and the impact that will have on how countries are going to deal with each other going forward?
Well, I'll start with Indonesia. So Indonesia, I mentioned earlier, Jokowi's coming up on the 10th year of 2 5-year terms. So that's the huge period of continuity in the domestic political context, and he's been able to achieve a lot. He has an 87% approval rating, sometimes 80%, depending on which poll you're looking at, and has a huge voice in supporting or not supporting the current contenders. So all of that to say that the two leading candidates are pledging continuity. They want Jokowi to support them, or at least not speak out against them. One is from Jokowi's own party, which he's distanced himself from, but is a friend and close political ally, who is from PDIP, which was Sukarno's party, and is led by his daughter, who was a former president herself, Megawati. The other main contender is Prabowo Subianto, who is Suharto's former son-in-law. He ran against Jokowi twice. They had a very heated political rivalry, and then he joined Jokowi's cabinet in this last term as Minister of Defense. He's a military man. And he is running with Jokowi's son as his VP candidate. So everyone's watching very closely to see how this plays out in the polls among Jokowi's supporters. Are they going to stay with his party, which is also in Indonesia, a lot of the politics are very regionally based, or will they, follow along with his son, who I should also mention a few weeks ago, Indonesia's constitutional court changed the age requirement to run for president or vice president, ostensibly to allow Jokowi's son, who's 36, to be the VP, and it is Jokowi's brother-in-law who is the head of the Constitutional Court. So Indonesians are not quite sure how they feel about this, and I think
I
it's
feel right at home. That's Pakistan. Could I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Because of that connection,
Yeah.
the other thing that's connected is civil military. So with Prabowo, is that representative of maybe a little bit of a backslide that I think has been ongoing for many years? But just talk a little bit about the civil military dynamic and whether the military is assuming or returning to maybe some sort of salience or visibility.
I think the way I would answer that is that Jokowi, when he came to office, I think many people really viewed him as a champion of democracy. That has not really turned out to be the case, as I just shared recent developments, but there's also been some scaling back in terms of the corruption eradication freedom of speech, other human rights considerations in Indonesia that have put on edge many in the human rights community, and that's been a consistent trend over the last 6 years in particular. Prabowo himself, I would say, also has not shown a deep commitment to democracy throughout his career. He served as a Kopassus officer. Many people blame him for the riots that happened when Suharto was pushed out of power in '98, which resulted in a lot of deaths and rapes of ethnic Chinese women in Jakarta. So I think, I would say that I don't see the military necessarily coming back into politics full force. They're still an influential stakeholder, certainly. I think there is a real risk of Indonesia continuing to slide back on the democracy scale. In terms of relations with the U.S. and China, Ganjar, who's from Jokowi's party, I mentioned earlier Sukarno's commitment to Palestine. I think we might see that elevated in terms of how he approaches the relationship with the U.S. Well, Prabowo, a military background, Minister of Defense, might tilt more towards the U.S. because of Indonesia's sovereignty concerns vis-a-vis China. But on balance, I don't see a huge change there. The other big factor is what happens in the U.S. election, right? And what impact another Biden or Trump administration has on the U.S.-China dynamic. Because we didn't have enough time in this panel to get into it, but Indonesia, ASEAN, it's still an effective way of engaging with great powers, but the space is shrinking, right? So you have these consensus-based organizations like ASEAN or APEC, which the US is hosting later this month in San Francisco, or G20. Very, very difficult to build consensus at a time when we're facing a lot of really significant global challenges. So whether or not that space continues to erode or stabilizes or hopefully marginally increases is going to be a key factor in whoever is sitting in Indonesia's presidential office, how they deal with it. Yeah.
So I was testifying about 2 weeks ago to the parliament of what I'll call a Western middle power U.S. ally. And one of the MPs said to me, if Trump comes back into office, that's a real risk for us. How do we prepare for that? And it was the single worst question I've ever been asked in a panel. I'm not going to lie, because I didn't. Usually, I can come up with something meaningful. I didn't have an answer. I hate, we're in DC, and so I don't mean to be U.S.-centric. My region doesn't tend to have a lot of elections, except ironically in Israel. And so even the elections that do exist in places like Kuwait for the parliament, obviously, there's usually bigger authorities. And places like Egypt that are having a very important upcoming election, it's not important because there's I think, a real question about what the outcome's going to be. It's a real question more about how El-Sisi and the parties are going to play this out and potential for very serious violence and anger being unleashed in the streets. But I think, to your point, there's so many elections that are happening that I think what has been a trend toward strategic autonomy in the Middle East, and it seems like Southeast Asia, certainly a trend in Europe toward more. It's hard for me to say what's right wing and left wing anymore. I don't know. I've lost the linear space on that. But a trend toward nationalism and ultranationalism, non-engagement in the world is so different. And I do know that the U.S. will be a pretty big key here. Now, I will say this. I am not as convinced as everybody else that Trump and Biden are actually going to be the nominees. I think Biden probably will. Trump, I still am hesitant. Not that he may not be the nominee, but we'll see if he can run. I think some of the court cases are more serious than people think. I think the 14th Amendment question is a very actually serious question that could cause some problems. We'll see. I just think there's a lot of X factors. But if we go that way again, look, a Trump administration is going to fundamentally change U.S. engagement in the world. Yeah. I think it will try to withdraw from NATO, and that will fundamentally change NATO. I think it may well withdraw from APEC, and that will fundamentally influence how it deals with China. And that's going to create space for a lot of countries to have both opportunities that wouldn't have been expected, countries like India, I think, in some ways, actually to try to fill some of that gap. And it's going to create a lot more risk for a lot of countries as well. So
countries like Pakistan.
Countries like Pakistan, absolutely. And so I will say, this is the most unhelpful way, and the members of parliament thought so too. If a Trump administration does come in, I think it will be the most unsettling time after a very long period of unsettling times that we've seen probably in the world in terms of how it reorganizes. And I think what we've seen thus far over the last kind of decade will be seen as kind of the prequel to a much bigger global reorganization.
Probably like to the 1930s. That's
yeah,
what Fred
I think that's probably a much better comparison.
Fred has been saying that.
Yeah.
Closing statement?
I think, honestly, as a Pakistani, for me, the opportunities that this changing world presents to Pakistan are much vaster and grander and deeper than the threats that this world represents. The opportunities that Afghan refugees and illegal Afghan citizens in Pakistan illegally, the opportunities that they represent for Pakistan and its economy and its public diplomacy far outweigh the supposed risks of some of them being terrorists. The opportunities in the rise of India, in the emergence of right-wing nationalistic extremist governments on all sides of Pakistan, the opportunities in the decoupling sort of dynamic and the technology competition, which the previous speaker spoke about, the opportunities far outweigh the risks. The opportunities of Vision 2030 for Pakistan, for it to engage with the PIF and with ADIA in reasonable transactions that are beneficial both to the elites, the Khaliji elites, as well as to Pakistani elites, are much greater than whatever rents Pakistan can extract or secure because of the inherent fears and anxieties that I think seize the Pakistani elites. So for me, there genuinely is a grand space and a wide runway available to Pakistan to do so in very quick time. I think again, the greatest example and precursor for that is, what Mohammed bin Salman has been able to do in Saudi Arabia in very quick time. The opportunities available to Pakistan from allowing and engaging and supporting women to be active members of the economic growth story of Pakistan. So all of those things represent a huge opportunity for an already middle power to be potentially a great power. And I think if you don't have that view or that excitement about Pakistan's potential, you're never going to be able to rip off the stink of where Pakistan is right now. It is not in a good place. Its elite have parked Pakistan in the worst parking lot on the planet, where it's neither going up nor down, nor has any idea of where it wants to go. And I think that, the sadness that I personally feel because of that, the pressure, the anxiety, the fears that a lot of us feel because of what's happening in North Gaza right now, all of that, and frankly in the West Bank, all of that also represents simultaneously opportunity for us to have deep and challenging conversations with each other, and at least within Islamabad, Pindi, and the rest of Pakistan, to challenge ourselves to rise to the occasion of these opportunities, because demographically and in many other ways, the traditional great powers of the world, the US, the West, are clearly making room for other countries and other parts of the world to adopt and engage with a more important leadership role in the world. And so why Pakistan can't be among those without being antagonistic to any country, I think is a mystery to me. And it's what makes me sort of excited about getting up in the morning and going to work every day.
Wonderful. I want to thank everybody for listening to, I thought was a fabulous panel. I think we even have follow-up panels that we can create with all of this great nuggets. So we are now done, and I think we will be back at 12:30, right, for people that are viewing online. So thank you very much.